If we take a look at the two same cows, what does that do to the milking availability for cows? A cow that's milking 75 pounds, again, she's 60 days in lactation. She can be milked 75 pounds divided by 22. She can now come 3.4 times. In the previous table, she could come 3.1 times per day. And I think this is where the question starts to become, with that cow, the 75-pound cow, do we lose milk production in her if we ask her to wait another hour or so to come to the robot? Now, depending on what her lactation number is, depending on what her lactation days is, the answer could be yes or no. But at 60 days, we would assume that she's about at her peak. She may have already peaked. She's probably still trying to preserve some of that high milk. But at 3.4 times a day, that's probably a little on the open side for a cow like that. But again, we don't know everything about this cow. If we take a look at that same 120-pound cow from the last example, we look at her number, and she's now a 5.5 times per day milking cow. So just by adjusting that by 2 pounds, that optimum expected yield, we've opened up the table for these two individual cows. Plus, we've opened the table for all cows by going from 2.8 to 3 milkings. So if we had to tighten it, right, we use that term, tighten the table, close it up a little bit. This is where we start to have those conversations when free time starts to drop. Stocking density is a little high. Where do we get some free time and open the box to cows that need the milkings versus all cows? Well, we've lowered our minimum number of milkings to 2.5. Now we're saying every cow in the herd in that column, the 31 days in milk to 14 days before dry off, are now guaranteed 9.6 hour access to the robot. On top of that, if they want to come more than 9.6 hours, come earlier than that, we have this optimum expected yield. Now, if this is raised, we're going to be asking cows to wait a little longer before they can come to the robot. We take the two same cows, 75-pound cow, 60 days in lactation. If we divide that by 28 pounds, her milk production, she can come 2.6 times per day, which is just a little over the minimum. So for the most part, this cow is going to be available right around that minimum number. The other cow, 120 pounds, 40 days in milk, take that 120 divided by 28, and you can see she comes from that 5.1 on the first table and 5.5 on the open table to now 4.3 times per day.
Yeah, now, just real quick, Adam. Had a question from Dr. Pete asking about a 190-pound cow and how she fits into the table, and maybe just expand on that. I think with your example in the 120-pound cow, or Pete, if you want to. Okay, he added, how evenly do you space cows? How evenly do cows usually space their approach? And then Pete, if you want to speak, if I didn't adequately address that, but.
No, you're doing great.
Good. Good.
Yeah, so with a 190-pound cow, I think we would look at the totality of the situation on the farm. Is she a one-off cow? Kind of an excellent cow within a group of cows that aren't quite achieving the same level of production, or is she a top cow, but there's also a lot of other top cows that are in there? So is that a high production herd to start with? Is that a 100-pound herd on average? The
close
optimum
to
is, yeah, close to it. Okay, so
yeah, the mature cows average 155 pounds between 40 and 100 days.
Okay, so we start to look at it, and my presentation doesn't go this far from a time situation. We don't go into more of the cow biology side of things, but we have to think about those kind of cows and say, okay, there's a lot of capacity in those animals to carry a lot of milk. So where does that optimum expected yield need to go for a herd that is milking that much, producing that much milk. That optimum expected yield should really climb with the production of the herd. And there's a comment in a future slide, but I'll mention it right now. The optimum expected yield should, whether you're doing it on a herd level or you're breaking it down to a group level, a milk access table for mature cows versus milk access tables for, say, heifers, you want to try to have that optimum expected yield somewhere around a third of the production of that herd or group. So if you had a, say, 100-pound herd average, you would want to have that table, that optimum expected yield above 30, closer to 32 or 33 pounds. And you're going to say to your cows, on average, you can come that 2.5, 2.6 times per day. But if you want to come that, 3, 4, 5 times per day, you're going to have to bring me, 33, 34, 35 pounds. But if a cow is milking 190 pounds, the belief there is the capacity is there to do it. She can hold that much milk, up to six times per day. So we'll look at some other scenarios here with, how to use the tools in T4C to analyze, groups of cows like that, and how the table would affect them versus, say, the lower producing cows. But it's a great question. So, why do we focus on the center column so much? I talked very briefly about that dry off side and the fresh side. We want to leave the fresh period open for cows, right? We start to get into that cow biology. The greatest opportunity to achieve maximum milk production out of an animal is during the fresh period. We want to encourage visits. We want to stimulate milk production through the milking process. But at some point, we know we reach a point where that cow has reached her behavior and her drive to come to the robot. And we don't want to leave that table so open, like that minimum 6, maximum 6 for a fresh cow. We don't want to extend that too long and allow cows to continue to come that often if they're not going to bring the milk with it. That's where we start to run into some free time and robot availability challenges. But if we focus on the center column, the 6, 24, and 2.8, we have a much larger group of animals that have to fit into that column. Right? We have cows that are in their peak, we have mid-lactation, and we have cows that are essentially getting ready to dry off, all trying to find access within that middle column. And so this is where we can't be afraid to drop that minimum milkings number down a little bit. Bring that down to 2.8, 2.7, 2.6, right? You have late lactation cows that aren't going to need more milkings than that. And they still have some capacity in their udder. It just takes them longer to fill their udder. So we're not necessarily going to lose milk, but we just want to be more efficient in the milkings that we provide them. And that opens up the time available to those high producing cows, either at peak or even your high production cows that are in mid lactation and even late lactation. They're using that optimum expected yield to earn visits above the minimum. So just a wider range of cows that fall into that middle column, which is why we see so much variation in the min and max numbers and where that optimum expected yield can really change up or down depending on what the situation is at the farm, either on a herd level or if we start to break it down into group level. So what are some, and I underline some because there's certainly more elements that go into the discussion, but these are some key ones that I would certainly take a look at and want to have in the discussion when talking about milk access. So milk production, are we looking at a herd setting or are we looking to break it down by parity? Would heifers benefit from their own table? Usually the answer there is going to be yes. This is where we have some good grouping tools within T4C to allow for cow versus mature cow versus heifer tables. We just know that heifers, first lactation animals, can't keep up with mature cows in production to get the milkings above those optimum expected yield numbers. You know, if we have an optimum expected yield of 28 or 30 for the mature cows, heifers are going to be limited in their milkings because we're asking them to wait a long time before they can come, and their udder capacity just isn't there to do it in many cases. Breed. We still want to try to achieve the same level of milkings, right? Fresh cows getting more milkings, high producing animals getting more milkings. But if we're looking at breed specifics, the optimum expected yield is probably going to be lower for a breed like Jerseys versus Holsteins. At the end of the day, the goal is the same, but the numbers just have to be more reflective of the breed that we're working with. Cow density in the robot barn and free time. Again, are fresh and high production animals able to take advantage of the milking opportunities we are giving them? It's one thing to say, well, I'm going to make my milk access changes so that I give my high producing and fresh cows more milkings and limit my low producing cows. But if there's some elements going on in the barn, either too many cows in the pen and some other management factors going into the daily routines, are they just not able to get to the robot? We can give them all the access we want, but at the end of the day, they still have to get themselves there to get milked. Robot efficiency. Is there excessive downtime for some reason, right? This comes maybe more into some of the daily maintenance and the daily routines to ensure optimal uptime of the system. And again, plays into the other discussion around those bottlenecks. Are there things that are going on in the barn every day that take robot access away from the cows? Slow milking cows, where do they fit into this picture? You know, is there opportunity to move away from some of these slower milking cows that really use up a lot of box time? Failures. We talked about that with the KPI earlier. Each failure uses an average of 6 to 8 minutes of box time. So you're really taking a milking away from an animal that maybe would milk successfully if we continue to allow high fail cows to stay in the barn, or we don't try to fix the problem, either machine related or individual animal related. But we always talk about what failure goals are. I mean, obviously we try to achieve the fewest as possible, but we start to want to take a closer look at things. If we start to see those failures sitting around 4 to 5 per robot per day, we want to start asking questions about that, because those add up. You start to take that 4 or 5 failures per day, and you factor that by 6, 7, 8 minutes per failure, and you're just really taking milking opportunities away from cows. Animal health. What are the risks if we over milk? Right. So if we allow too many milkings per cow per day, we have that open table as we talked about. What are the implications of having that? Over milking cows that don't necessarily need to be milked. There's a lot of health, whether it's teat end health, udder infection opportunities by over milking. What risks are present if we under milk? So if we don't have enough visits to the robot, if cows are challenged to get to the robot and get milkings, what are some of the challenges there, right? We have over full cows leaking milk, and we certainly know what will happen with too many cases of cows that are leaking milk in stalls, laying in puddles of milk, just not able to get into the robot if they're standing around waiting for too long. And there's certainly a milk production element that goes into there as well. If we're not harvesting the milk at the right time, we are having a negative impact on that animal's ability to produce efficiently for us. And then there's some financial components that come into play. What is a valuable milking relative to the udder capacity, right? Again, the under milking, over milking question. What's the right time to milk the cow? And each milking has cost. Every time the cow walks in and is going to be milked, we're using our brushes, we're using the sprays, there's a consumable aspect to each milking. So, we want to ask ourselves every time that cow walks into the robot, is it worth using the consumables at that point in time on that animal for what she's bringing me at that point in time? So I'll run through a few reports here for maybe the next 10 minutes, and then I want to leave plenty of time for some Q&A. So I'll touch on those reports I listed earlier and just show you how we can quickly use them to try to pull a farm's story together and try to determine where a milk access adjustment may need to occur, or if we're very close to where we want to be. First report, the visit behavior, number 35. If we sort this on the milk yield per milking, we can start to get a sense of, are there high average yields per milking with low number of milkings? So we're seeing a lot of cows, not coming very often, and when they do come, they're bringing a lot of milk. Are these cows that should be doing that, or are these cows that are doing that because there's access challenges for them and we would like to see them come more? Or if we flip the list the other way and go to the other side of it, low average yield per milking with high number of milkings, so cows that are taking advantage of an open access setting. But this report's really good to get a sense of what the capacity is of some of our cows. We start to go back into that capacity discussion. What is the average yield per milking for the herd? And where does that play into our optimum expected yield? So who are the cows that are fitting into those two scenarios that I just described above, the high milk yield, low milkings, or low milk, high milkings? And is there something we can start to do to change that behavior a little bit? Robot efficiency, a very popular report, number 41. The column that's of most interest here is that average milk yield per box time per week. So how much milk am I getting per minute of box time? So we're looking at the whole time that she's in the box, not just when the cup units are on. So is there a cow that takes a long time to attach? And how does that contribute to her overall box time relative to the amount of milk that we get when she leaves the box? So these low numbers that we see, like a 4.8, 4.9, 5.0, that's going to be, again, the pounds of milk that I get from her for every minute she's standing in the box. Now, we can certainly identify some of our least efficient cows in the farm, but this isn't an end-all be-all list that says, okay, the lowest cow has to go. That's not how I would use this list, but it starts to identify some of the cows that maybe are candidates for a career change. Of course, we want to look at the totality of the report. We want to look at day production. We want to look at the lactation days. Is this a cow that's getting ready to go dry? I'm not going to be concerned about a cow that's going dry in a week, and she's falling on the lower end of this report. But where is she in her lactation days? Is this a cow that really is a slow milking cow, and she's really using a lot of box time relative to her peers? Again, with the failure discussion, looking at that failed reports, who are some of the cows that are heavy hitters on the report? And look at some of those box times listed there. Remember, every failure is taking about 6 to 8 minutes of time away from other cows. And if we don't identify and correct the issue either with the cow or a group of cows, you can see, for example, this first cow listed here, cow number 26, she's got 4 failures. Each of those failures consumed about 6 minutes and 40 seconds. If she wasn't failing or she wasn't in the barn, those 6.5 minutes would be going to other cows that would more or less likely be milking successfully. So where are you missing on some milk in the tank opportunities with these failures. Milkings per hour. So another graph in T4C that is based on a 7-day average by default. So we can look for trends in the barn that are impacting cows' ability to get to the robot. Now, what are some of the questions we would have around this report? What times of the day do we see diminished milkings? Are they around the wash cycles, which is something we can't avoid, but they're clearly shown here. We can see a wash at 7 a.m., 2 p.m., and 10 p.m. When does the feed truck come by? Does that pull a lot of cows away from the beds and from the robots to get a fresh bite to eat? What is our fetch cow protocol? How many fetch cows do we have? And that's maybe another discussion, but how much time do we spend in the pens to get those fetch cows, and what impact does it have on the natural behavior of the other cows and their ability to get to the robot? When do we push feed? Goes kind of along that same line as the feed truck. When we come by and push feed, what does that do for the cows from a behavior standpoint? They want to go and get that fresh bite of feed. But other things that come into play, right? Other disruptions in the pens. How do we bed? When's herd check? What's our hoof trimming protocol? At the end of the day, we know we have to be in the pens, but how do we get more efficient in our routines so that we can minimize that time and ensure that we are allowing as much access to that robot or robots as possible? The number of milkings per cow per day. This is going to be the last couple of graphs that I show before we move to Q&A. But this report by default shows all cows as a dot with their day production on the Y and number of milkings on X. And what we're looking for here is that our higher producing, our higher yielding cows are the ones that are able to milk more often. And as we start to break this graph down a little bit, if we put a line at where the bulk tank average is for the herd, and we take the average number of milkings for the herd, say 2.8, and we now have 4 quadrants out of this graph. And what we're trying to identify are their cows in the bottom right, which are producing below tank average, but are coming more than the average milkings, right? So they're low producing but high milking. And what would we have to do to start to see some of these cows coming back on their milkings a little bit? How can we bring these cows down in milkings but without sacrificing on milk production? We know that they're not going to lose milk if we pull some milkings away from them. We see a lot of other cows that are in the same production range doing that. Now you can break this report down, you can filter it down and do it specifically for heifers, for mature cows. You can strip out fresh cows, so you're not necessarily being critical of a fresh cow that's a low production to start, but she's high on milkings. So always keep that in mind. But we're looking for trends here. And on the flip side, who are some of these high production cows? So they're producing above tank average, but they're below average milkings. These are the kind of cows that we're saying, why aren't they coming more? They should earn more milkings. The access should be there for them, but what's preventing them from coming more? Is it the cows in the bottom right that are taking up milking time that could be better utilized with the cows in the top left? So how do we get them over there? And if these kind of cows were visiting more, would we see some higher opportunity for milk production from them? With that 100-pound cow that's coming probably 2.5 or 2.6 times per day, would she be 120, 130 pounds, maybe more, if she were able to come that additional milking per day? And that starts to fall into that discussion around capacity. Are they hitting their capacity and they're overextending, and it's having a detrimental impact on their overall production per day? Another graph is it's an import report that's available through the FMS team, through Katie and us on the North American level. It's milking allowance analysis. So what we're looking at here is the actual milkings for the cows, which are represented in yellow, versus what the milk access is allowing based on the settings for the animals, which are represented in blue. So what we can see is, without even having to look at the milk access tables, we can see that this probably has a minimum setting of 3, right? Because you see a very flat grouping of 3 blue dots straight across, but you see all the dots below it where these animals aren't really milking 3 times a day. They're just guaranteed the 3. But as you start to look to the right, and you can see that minimum 3 milkings, and as we look to the right, we see that the table's starting to allow the increased number of milkings for cows that are milking above the optimum expected yield. But we can see that there's a lot of the yellow dots that don't really get to that blue line level. And so we probably have a situation where the optimum expected yield is fairly low relative to the production level of the herd. So we have an open access on the table. Now, if the herd isn't challenged with free time, they're not the robot capacity isn't quite used up. Maybe they're 50 to 55 cows per robot. They have plenty of free time. They're not too concerned about it. But I think from a discussion standpoint, you would look at that and maybe try to discuss some of the other elements that go into, even with a lot of free time or enough free time, why would it be good to optimize that milk access table and bring it more in line with what the cows are doing? Again, those financial animal health discussions start to come into play there. So after making a milk access change, and I actually did this yesterday, I went onto a system, and when you make a milk access change, this report will change automatically. The milkings, the yellow dots don't change, but your milk access, as soon as you make a change in milk access, you automatically change the allowed milkings per cow, and cows would start to feel that effect as they start to come to the robot. They might start to refuse a little bit, but you can see what happens here when we drop that minimum milkings of 3 down to 2.7. I think I dropped it to. And you can see now that that's a little lower than where it was before. So we're telling some of these lower production cows, you weren't coming 3 times before, but I'm going to make sure you don't come and eat up any box time that you don't need. But if we look out to the 2 distinct kind of climbing blue milk access lines, one's for the heifers and one's for the cows, right? So this herd that I was working with yesterday, this happened to be the demo herd, they have a table for the heifers and they have a table for the cows. So I have different optimum expected yields for the heifers and for the cows, but you can see 2 very distinct lines going up for each of those groups. And then you can see where the yellow dots from the milkings number start to get a little more in line with those optimum expected yields and what the milkings are that we're given to those high production cows. But you can see there's still a few cows that get a lot more milkings, closer to 5 and 5 plus, and those are going to be either fresh cows or just high production animals. So we tighten that up. We have more time for those high yielding cows, and hopefully again with either limiting some obstructions in the barn itself to prevent cows from coming, we give them the access and they take advantage of it. So final points as we jump into more of a Q&A session, but when milk access changes occur, who makes the changes and monitors? Right, this is something that we see a lot. We make a change and then who comes back and who keeps an eye on it, who looks to see that it's doing what we want it to do, and then is there an opportunity to make another change? We always recommend working with the Lely Center, work with folks like Katie, because they can help analyze, just like we kind of did in the short session here, but she has access to a full spectrum of Lely tools that help support this process. Also, we can monitor the history of changes. Every milk access table has a date change at the bottom where you can see, has it been a year, has it been 3 months, has it been 2 weeks? What's been the process of going through this discussion and optimization? When making changes, take small bites. The cows will tell you what they can handle from a change standpoint. If our table hasn't been changed in a year and it's quite obvious, it would be a good idea to start making that change. We don't want to start making optimum expected yield changes of more than a pound or two at one time. Every time we start to tighten up the table, we're going to start to tell some cows, you can't come as often as you used to. So they have to learn when their new time is, right? They're going to feel that refusal, and they're going to say, well, geez, I used to come right now, and now I can't. And it'll take them a few days to get back to a cycle that where they know they can milk. And then after going through a week or 2 weeks, depending on the type of change that was made, come back and make another small change and let the group of cows feel that change again. But you don't want to make so much of a change that cows all of a sudden are thrown off by 2, 3, 4 hours of access. That would be that would have a negative impact on visit behavior. Refusals would climb quite heavily, and milk production would probably take a little bit of a hit. So slow and monitor. Milk access is not a set it and forget it. We have our milk access that we start at startup, and then typically maybe a month or a little over 2 months out, we start to tighten things up on those newly trained cows. But wherever that table sits 2 months after startup probably shouldn't be where it's set a year after startup, right? We anticipate changes within that herd over the course of the year, particularly after startup, increased milk production potentially. As free time starts to change, all those things have to continuously be monitored. The table should follow production trends. So again, don't set it, forget it. If there's some seasonal variation in the herd, we get into a really hot spell in the summer. If the herd takes a little drop in production, we may have to drop that optimum expected yield just a little bit to ensure that cows are still able to get a very similar access to the robot, because there's some feed implications there. If we all of a sudden have some seasonal effect that either allows more milkings or decreases milk production, that could have an impact on the cow's ability to get into the robot and consume the feed that we want her to eat. So keep an eye on those kind of things. Again, I mentioned it before, performance increasing post-startup. The other thing is, if you're anticipating a lot of cows coming into the system, either through maybe an expansion project, or you've been low in numbers for a while and maybe you're going to purchase some cows, or you just have an influx of heifers coming into the system. If you know free time is going to take a hit at that point, don't wait until all those cows come to the barn before you make these milk access changes. Work towards that. Start limiting the cows now and get that herd in a position where when all these new cows come in, it's not going to throw the existing cows off too much. I talked about it a little bit earlier. Rule of thumb, aim to have that optimum expected yield within that 1 to 2 pounds of bulk tank average divided by 3. So a third of your bulk tank average, and then optimize from there. And then as a little bit of a plug for next week, the feed program has a high correlation to the visit behavior in a free flow barn. We're talking about opening the access or allowing access for the right cows at the right time, but we still need to get the cows there. And what's the draw for the cows to get to the robot? It's going to be talked about next week with the feed, PMR, and T4C discussion that my colleague Ben Thorpe is going to join the group for. So I hope you're all able to come back and learn from Ben more about that aspect of visit optimization.
Good. Yeah, thank you so much, Adam. Really appreciate that So a couple questions right off the bat. Question was, how evenly do cows space their approach? And I'll just kind of field that from Dr. Pete. Kind of like we've talked about, it's going to help you tailor this to cows' production. So one thing I want to emphasize is just because we give those cows access to come and milk doesn't mean they will. So if you have, a sluggish cow or, training heifers, especially early in lactation, just because you've opened up milk access there, doesn't mean they're going to go. So make sure that you have a good training program in place. And then going from there. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it right on the head, particularly with heifers. Training is key. We see, and we've been looking at this as an FMS&A team with some small projects, some research. One of our colleagues out in Western U.S. is going to be presenting at our FMS conference this year. But really, the impact of pre-training heifers, if their ability is there, that's not always an option in some of the systems. But either pre-training heifers or just having a very sound fetching program for those heifers that come in for that first week of production. Right, milk production and energy needs are not going to be the driver for heifers. They're not producing enough milk at that point to feel the demand of going to the robot to capture additional energy sources. So for them, it's more about building a behavior. Fortunately, heifers aren't pre-exposed to other milking systems, at least not on a long-term basis. We see some farms that milk heifers in a parlor for a little while before they put them in the robot barn, but that's not necessarily going to throw off the ability to train them. But behavior in the heifers is what we're looking for out of a solid fetching routine. For high production cows and giving them access and how do they use it and how do they space it apart, a lot of that's going to come down to the feed aspect. We know that the cow is going to have some energy demands. We know we're purposely trying to pull some of that demand, some of that supply away from the bunk and replacing it with energy in the robot. So based on the feed settings and the ability to regulate how much feed an animal gets per visit, she's going to want to come back for more. She's going to know that that's a source of that energy. And if we can somewhat regulate how much she gets per visit, she'll come back for more. She's going to seek it. And once she knows when she's allowed to come and get it, that's when you start to see cows build these very strict, you can just observe it. You can see cows that come to the robot and they refuse and they literally walk around and 1 minute later they get milked, right? They time it right down to minutes of where their access is. So that's really the beauty of the cow in these systems.
Yeah, and there's plenty to unpack with that for sure, but like you said, I kind of look at them like they ping the robot. They just like to come in. They don't like to waste time. And if you think about it, they're just trying to be very efficient mamas. They don't like to waste time. They don't like to stand around. So a lot of times these cows do figure out when their access window is, and they'll get that schedule, which again is why I appreciate Adam emphasizing you don't want to take too big of a bite too quick if you're trying to tighten up that table, because you are wrecking their world in doing that, and they just need a little bit of time to adjust. And so slow steps. Follow-up question to that would be using photo period control affect visits at night?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions out there about lighting and impacts at night or complete darkness versus some lights on. I suspect that's what the question was, if I heard it right.
Mm-hmm.
We still go by recommendations for optimal daylight or lights on hours of the day versus dark time for the cows to mimic that spring summer natural light situation that they would experience in nature. Where we see lighting it may have an impact on visits is if there's some odd lighting around the robot relative to the rest of the barn. So if the rest of the barn goes out, but there's some lighting around the robot that creates some, a perceived obstacle to the robot, some odd shadowing, that can sometimes throw some cows off. I think lights around the robot are more for us as the people. Some thing in our minds that if the light's on around the robot, that'll keep things flowing better. But realistically, we see a lot of situation where it's a complete dark out in the barn around the robot room, and cows see very well in the dark. They find their way into the robot. The robot doesn't need lights to operate. I think it's more or less just monitor and see if there's any change in visit behavior. Use that milkings per hour report and look to see if all other things being equal, there's no feed availability challenges or there's no other things going on in the nighttime hours that would have an effect on visits. Is there some correlation to a drop in visit behaviors or an increase in visit behaviors centered around when lighting conditions change in the barn?
Good. Next question from Dr. Rosler. Does milk access table use previous 24 hours of averaged milk yield or the 7-day average, especially for an early lactation cow?
Yeah, so for early lactation, you're more or less guaranteeing cows a lot of access to begin with. So there isn't a lot of information for the system to work off of yet to have any kind of known, particularly in that first week, a known milk production level that's capable of determining when a cow should come. So that's why we guarantee minimums. Milk access changes don't necessarily use 7-day averages, but they're dynamic to the day. So if you make changes, you're changing that cow's access as soon as that change is made relative to her day production. So that's why, again, I would emphasize if you're making changes, make them in small bites, because cows are used to their visit schedules, and as soon as we start to make these changes, we're starting to disrupt their normal visit schedule.
Yeah.
Of course, as cows are climbing in milk production, they start to earn more visits, but there is some calculation. I can't speak to the totality of the calculations internally, but yes, there's some prevention, so to speak, of a cow that drops in milk production due to some mastitis, that there isn't an instant negative visit behavior or access, I should say, visit access because of a 1 or 2 day slowdown in milk production. We still want to make sure that animal, if she's willing to still come to the robot, if she's feeling under the weather. Same thing with a cow in heat. We're not going to knock a cow for being in heat and maybe drop some milk production for a day.
Very good. A question from Joe Ramsire. How does the capacity optimization affect cow access? If you have time to touch on that in a couple sentences.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and I should have said thanks to Dwight too. It's nice to get some questions from familiar names and faces that I've been able to interact with out in the past. But yeah, capacity optimizer. So it's an additional tool within T4C that I think it finds its place when all other things have been done, right, from a milk access standpoint. I didn't touch on it here because I think really my goal today was to ensure that there was a good, sound understanding of milk access, how it works, how the system calculates access relative to cows at different levels of production, and the tools that are used to evaluate milk access either how it's set right now, and then where there's some opportunity for change. The capacity optimizer setting is an additional tool that will allow some wiggle room within the optimum expected yield numbers to either grant a little more access to certain animals or pull access away from other cows within a window of the optimum expected yield. And it tries to identify capacity of an animal more to the individual cow herself rather than to an average. But I think that what's really important is before even thinking of using that tool, all other things should be exhausted as far as making sure the access table is correct. The capacity optimizer has very little to no effect if it's turned on and the table's too open. It can't do its job if the table isn't what I would say is optimized to the herd that you're working with. If you're challenged for free time, you've tightened up your table, you've limited milkings to low production animals, you've raised that optimum expected yield about as high as the herd can handle. The capacity optimizer would be one extra level of, can we capture a little bit more free time and maybe get 1 or 2, 3 more milkings in the day total. But again, it's something that everything else has to be right before that really can have an effect.
Yeah, very good conversation. Another question from Dwight, for milk access table, does the minimum milkings recalculate every day for each cow, or does it use the rolling previous 7-day average?
So the minimum, like I said, the minimum milkings are guaranteed for every animal. Where the system grants her more access is, again, by taking a look at her daily production against the optimum expected yield. And if she walks into the robot and the system feels that she has reached a level of production, her interval relative to her milk production is at or near the optimum expected yield, she'll be allowed to milk. That's they say it's a dynamic setting, because if I make a milk access change now, a cow that walks in 5 minutes after I made that change, if she was allowed to milk at that interval before I made the change, she'll be refused at that new time if the table changed enough to have an impact on her visit schedule. So this is a little different than feed. And we'll talk more about this next week with our colleague Ben. But feed is something that's calculated at midnight and is projected for the next 24 hours, so that there's a guaranteed amount of feed throughout the day, each hour. But milk access is really looking at essentially every time the cow walks in, has she met the parameters of what the milk access table is set to grant a milking at this point in time. So I hope that that answers that question.
Yeah. Question. Go ahead.
I was just going to say these are all great questions. I really appreciate them. Thanks to Wade and others that have jumped on. And after this call, we may not get everything completely answered or addressed today, but always stay in touch with Katie and the FMS group, and we'll make sure we address any specific questions, especially if they're specific to a particular farm. It's definitely one of those things where we could talk in some generalities on a session like this, but when we start getting into the individual farm scenarios, then it warrants a deeper dive into that specific farm's T4C. It's an overall scenario.
Yeah, there is a question here from Mr. Dickerhoof from Milk Immediately, and Aaron, I'll talk with you about that here after the meeting, because I think his question is milk immediately in the first 10-14 days fresh for fresh heifers, and there's a couple different ways you can do that, just to help that out. One thing I really appreciated was your conversation there, Adam, on identifying your milk production, and that graph that you had with milk production and actual visits that are happening in the herd, and wanting to move cows that are below average on the tank maybe back with respect to fresh cows, and trying to keep those out of the mix too. But I think that's one of the hardest things for producers to do, is to take milkings away from cows who are producing well, not super good, or, not setting the world on fire. But if they're doing a good job, it's really, really hard for people to want to pull milkings away from them. So I guess what my question is when you're looking at that from an udder capacity standpoint, do you have a rough idea in your mind of where you're going to start herding animals from visits, that are maybe later in lactation, maybe haven't earned visits because they're not super high in production? But where do we start seeing that udder capacity become too full?
Yeah, so I think that the udder capacity story is really a presentation all in of itself. But I guess a very short version of it would be, if we think about our high production cows, whether we're thinking about our mature animals, or if we're looking at heifer tables, we know as these cows hit a peak, we know that they warrant additional milkings relative to their milk production through that ramp up period. But that's also the time when we can achieve, or at least give cows the opportunity to reach maximum capacity in their udder, right? When we know we can turn that valve on and have that thing consistently producing milk and filling the udder at a certain rate, or rate per hour, like a fill rate. At some point, we hit the final point of that, right around peak. And we know no matter how many more times we milk that cow, she's not going to increase her fill rate anymore, right? Biological changes in the cow are starting to say, okay, I've met my genetic capacity here, and from this point on, it's more or less how do we maintain that level of fill and take advantage of that cow's capacity for as long a period as we can as we come out of that post-peak period, right? And that's where we start to look at the persistency of the individual cow or group of cows. But inevitably, there is going to start to be some tailing off of production. What we don't lose is the cow's ability to hold milk, right? A cow that's mid to late lactation, still has capacity, as if she were a fresh cow, from the standpoint that the udder can hold 25 or 30 pounds. The question is going to be, at what point do we milk that cow and retrieve the milk? And she's got a slower fill rate. So we're not necessarily losing capacity of the udder. What we're trying to take advantage of is the fact that a cow fills her udder at a slower rate as she gets into later lactation. Now, a cow that's continuing to be a high production cow in totality of the day, she's still going to earn additional milkings, just as if she were 70, 80 days in milk and a high production cow. That's where that optimum expected yield still gives a late lactation animal the ability to come 3-4 times a day if her total milk production is maintained. But as cows start to slow off, we start to see that at the tail end. At what point do cows start to have that dramatic tail off in their lactation curve? We can still maintain capacity, but we just don't need to milk them as often. And I think that, again, that goes into a whole other discussion, maybe another future webinar session can focus more on udder capacity and some of the things that come into play, particularly in these robot situations where at various stages of lactation we can really take advantage of a cow's fill rate relative to her overall ability to hold milk, and then finding the right time to milk that cow without overfilling, but yet not milking too soon, that we're starting to over milk cows.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adam. So I know we've kind of reached our time limit here. Appreciate you all staying on. I think the questions were great, and so for that. But I just want to leave you with this point. I think if there's anything that you might have realized from this is it's not a one size fits all. So I'd love to continue the conversations with you if you have more questions or if you haven't touched your milk access table in a while. We're happy to just review that. I'm happy to review that with you, and go through that again. So we will see you next week, same time, same place, on here. And again, appreciate everyone attending. Have a wonderful rest of your day.